Welcome to Dave Talks Comics. I'm Dave, and this is my podcast, where I talk about comic books, cartoons, and comic book conventions. This is episode 172. All past episodes can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. In addition to the program's website, the podcast can also be found in a number of places where my podcast can usually be found. Well, where podcasts can usually be found, like iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. You can find my notes and what I have read at davetalkscomics.net. I'm going to be talking about some books that I read. There might be some spoilers, although these aren't new or very recent comic books that I'll be talking about. So no real spoilers this time around. Today is May 10th, 2020. I have been working from home for 2 months now. I'm not exactly enjoying it, but I'm grateful that I've got a job and that it still pays. But it's also been interfering with my reading time. I don't recall if I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but I usually do most of my comic book reading during my commutes because I take the train and the bus, sometimes walk, sometimes bicycle to work, and it takes me usually about an hour and 15 minutes or so to get to work, sometimes longer, and get home. That's one way, the commute. So it gives me, I usually have at least a half hour to read, 25 minutes, a half hour on the train to read, and maybe sometime on the bus, depending on whether I walk from my apartment to the metro station or not. So that's been completely eliminated. I've been going out for walks, but I can't really read while I'm walking. I usually go out for a walk before I start work, unless it's pouring rain, which has happened a few times, or unless I've got something that absolutely has to get done first thing in the morning. So, actually, the only thing that I've been reading with any consistency that I was reading before the lockdown, before this whole pandemic situation started, is the collections of Terry and the Pirates. I've finished off, finally, the first collection of Terry and the Pirates. I think it's called The Complete Terry and the Pirates or something like that. There's 6 volumes from IDW. At this point, I own all 6 of them. And each volume is about 2 years, although the first volume was a little over 2 years. It's 1934 to 1936, but it started in October of 34, and it goes all the way through December 36, and even has the first couple strips from 37. So I'm actually into the second book, Terry and the Pirates. I'm up to February. I'm in early February of 1937. And I'm into the first arc that starts in the second book. And this is the 11th arc overall, and I'm going by the Terry and the Pirates companion as far as where one arc begins and another one ends. I think there are fewer. I found another list online. I may have mentioned this before. I found another list online that had 60 arcs outlined in the 12 years that Milton Caniff wrote and drew Terry and the Pirates, but I think there's some number slightly lower than that, maybe 45, 50 arcs, according to the one in the Terry and the Pirates Companion, which is written by Carl Horak. Now, I think I got pretty lucky because I found it online. I've continued to look for it. It's not easy to find, as far as I can tell, on eBay or Amazon. I think I paid about $25 for it, something like that, which I think was the cover price, but the copy I got is it's like something like 25 years old, and it's a bit water damaged, got some water stains on it, and it's not in perfect shape. But it is a nice piece to have to help me, to guide me a bit through this series. It's I don't agree with it. It consists of both commentaries and descriptions of each arc. I don't agree with everything that the writer has to say about the comic strip, but it's interesting. So anyway, I'm 2 years into Terry and the Pirates, and if I can stick with this, and I'm reading a page a day, and a page is either 3 daily strips or 1 Sunday strip, it should take me something like another 4.5 years to finish off the 5 volumes that I have left to read. So I've been going at a pretty good clip since I think something like October of last year, and that's not when I started. I'd started before that, but then I'd gotten interrupted and on a couple occasions, and it was a little tough to get into this strip. It's definitely dated, but the strip definitely improves in that first volume. You can definitely see improvements if you compare the strips early in the book to the strips later in the book, and the sorts of stories, the sorts of characters that are in it. There are some things that don't really improve, or don't improve enough for me as far as I'm concerned, but I'm sticking with it. I'm continuing to read it, and as I might have mentioned before, this is partly because it's something that my father read when he was a kid, and we talked about briefly. Unfortunately, he passed away 7 years ago, so I can't talk to him about it anymore, but I see it as some way of reconnecting with him. Now, in a similar vein, I recently picked up a 75-80% of the run of the Steve Canyon comic magazine, would probably be the best way to put it, that Kitchen Sink produced back in the 1980s, maybe into the early 90s, but it started in 1983. I believe January of 83 was the first issue. And I didn't really have an interest in picking this up until I found out recently that Milton Caniff was actually involved and would write text pieces for every issue of this series. So I went online and I looked for it, and I first looked on mycomicshop.com, and the issues there ranged in price from about $10, $5 to about $10, I would say. I don't have the website pulled up right now, so I'm not certain. Some of them may have even been a little more than that. So I went to eBay, because sometimes you can find some pretty good deals on eBay, and I did. I found somebody selling, they had 20 of the first 21 issues, and they were asking $50 for it, plus another like it was like $8 for shipping or something like that, or $6 for shipping. But it also had the make me an offer, something like that. Whatever that button is that you can make the seller an offer. So I clicked on that, and I ended up putting in $42 as an offer, and it came back like right away. Within 5 minutes, the guy responded and agreed to it. So with shipping, and then there's tax on that, it came to like $51. So I paid what, like $5 an issue? No, not even. I paid like $2.50 an issue, something like that. For 20 of the first 21 issues, it's only missing issue 11, and if I have to pay $10 or $8 to get that, so be it. I haven't tried to track that down just yet. But as I said, these issues have text pieces. Some are by Milton Caniff, because he was still alive at that time. He died in 1988. And actually, the series outlived him. The magazine series outlived him. I believe he died sometime around the 18th issue, or that has the last text piece by him, and it continued on to 26 issues. The format changes a little bit, but basically all of the strips are reprinted in black and white, including the Sunday strips, which were, of course, originally printed in color. Although I'm not sure if he was actually coloring the strips or not. Probably not. That was probably being done by somebody at the newspaper syndicate that printed it. But of course, he wasn't able to reprint Terry and the Pirates at that time because he didn't own Terry and the Pirates, but he did own Steve Canyon. So So I've read the text piece that he wrote in the first issue of Steve Canyon, and it's basically all about how it got started, because he basically made this deal like 2 years or almost 2 years before he stopped drawing Terry and the Pirates. He wanted ownership of Terry and the Pirates, and the syndicate he was working with wouldn't give it to him. And so he signed on with another syndicate to create his own strip, which gave him ownership. He wanted ownership of the strip. He wrote, he drew it. I believe the only thing he didn't do for it, I'm not sure about the coloring, as I mentioned, on the Sunday strips. I doubt he did the coloring, and he had a letterer who would letter the book. And the other thing that he did, or that he didn't do, but that somebody else did, and this is true for both Terry and the Pirates and Steve Canyon, is the logo, which would appear on the Sunday strip, because of course there wasn't space for it in the daily strip. For both of those strips was designed by Noel Sickles, who I want to say is best known for drawing another cartoon strip called Scorchy Smith. And as you'll see in my notes for the first volume, and if you've got the first volume of Terry and the Pirates, you can read this. The Noel Sickles and Milton Caniff were lifelong friends. They met in the late 20s, I want to say. Maybe it was the early 30s. And worked together. They shared a studio at one point. I'm not sure who died first or what the age difference was between the two, or if they were born in the same year. But anyhow, so I've read the introduction to the first volume of Terry and the Pirates of Steve Canyon, the first collection of Steve Canyon, and it has like maybe 6 months worth of the comic strip in there. And it's got this nice long text piece all about how it got started, how he was working on it on the side, but he couldn't actually draw anything, because if he drew anything, he was still under contract to the original syndicate, and they would have owned anything that he drew. And so he couldn't draw any strips until after. So all he could do was talk to people about it and plan it. They talk a little bit about the publicity for it. And apparently the very first strip of Steve Canyon was actually covered on the front page of a number of newspapers. It was that big a deal at that time. So I think that's all I have to say about Steve Canyon. So moving on, I have managed to read a few other comic books, but I'm just not reading as frequently or as much as I was before. Now, I wasn't reading a ton before, but I would read 2 or 3 comic books a week. I'd say it's gotten to the point where I'm lucky if I'm reading 2 or 3 a month, and maybe I'm doing a little better than that, but I'd say it's lucky if I'm reading 1 a week. I'm not even sure if I've read 1 this week, not counting, of course, Terry and the Pirates. But one thing that I did manage to finally finish off is Project Pegasus, and this is the story which ran in Marvel 2-in-1 issues 53 to 58, I believe, of Marvel 2-in-1. And this is a story that I'd heard about for a long time. I wrote about it, something about the story, even though I hadn't read it yet, just that I was interested in it and some of the details for it, because it's been reprinted a few times and the different ways it's been reprinted. And so there's something, if you search for Project Pegasus at DaveTalksComics.net, you'll find something about it there. But I read the first 3 issues, then I took a break, and I was starting to read the next 3, and that's when this whole lockdown happened. And so it took me probably a month and a half or something like that to read those last 3 issues. But I finally finished it off. I enjoyed it. I believe the story came out in 1979 in Marvel 2-in-1. The first half of the strip of the story was drawn by John Byrne, the first 3 issues, and the last 3 issues were drawn by George Perez, which was part of my interest in reading this, of course. It was written, I believe, by Ralph Macchio and Mark Gruenwald, I believe, are the writers on it. Now, it is, it's definitely a creation of its time, but it's probably one of the better creations of its time. It doesn't, if I compared it to something like Watchmen, it would not compare to something like that. It's not on that sort of level. But if you enjoy the stories that were coming out in the 1970s, I'd say it's a good story. You have a number of different guest stars. Let's see if I can remember them in order. There's Quasar, there is Deathlock, there is Giant Man, there's Thundra, there's Wondar, and then there's the Aquarian. And actually, it's kind of a twofer because Wondar and the Aquarian are really the same character. Anyhow, it's a good read. I enjoyed it. I'm still working on my write-up of the last issue, but maybe it'll be out by the time this issue comes out. But the other 5 issues, I've already posted my thoughts on them at DaveTalksComics.net. And as always, DaveTalksComics.net is where my notes are. .net for the notes and .com for the cast, as I like to say. One of the other things that I started to do and I've kind of dropped off on is I started to do a random comic from my collection thing, and I've posted some of these on Twitter and also at DaveTalksComics.net. And I've got all my comic books in a spreadsheet and classified by whether it's a trade, whether it's digital, whether it's, is it trade or not? Is it digital or not? Or, trade, I mean really collected edition or not? Because I've got a few omnibuses, a few absolute editions. Do I have a few? I think I just have one, the New Frontier. But I've got a few omnibuses, a few of those, big collections. I've certainly got some DC Archives, some Marvel Masterworks. But I by far, I have much more trade paperbacks than anything else. Not a big fan of the huge, really thick collected editions. I prefer things that are, up to about 300 pages. But anyway, I've been doing these random things, and I was posting them. And one of the things that I posted was an issue of Xenozoic Tales. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure if the correct pronunciation is Xenozoic or Xenozoic. But for some reason, Xenozoic sounds right to me, but I quite often say Xenozoic. I wanted to go back and read this series a few years ago, and I picked up Death Rattle number. I have a complete collection of the original issues. I have collected editions of these issues, and not everything is collected in every collected edition. I have the 3 kitchen sink trade paperback collections. I have the Xenozoic collection, the big, thick Xenozoic collection that was done by just a couple years ago, and I can't remember who the publisher was. I don't have the Dark Horse collected edition, which came out like about 15, 17 years ago, something like that. Because the collection, there was Death Rattle number 8, which introduced the series, and then there was 14 issues of the regular series across about 7 or 8 years, something like that. The Kitchen Sink, I believe, published all 14 issues, plus the issue of Death Rattle. But the collected edition, the third volume of the Kitchen Sink collected edition, only went up to issue 12, and I don't believe they ever collected issues 13 and 14. But the Dark Horse collected edition, the 2 volumes, I believe that did include issues 13 and 14. But after those 3 volumes of the Kitchen Sink collected edition, I don't believe any of the other collected editions included the stories that Mark Schultz did not draw. Even though he wrote them, I believe they were all drawn by Steve Stiles. They didn't include any of them in any of the other collected editions. So, and those stories certainly do help to fill in. So I've started to read Xenozoic Tales again. I don't think I ever read the last 2 issues of Xenozoic Tales. I found this series in 1989. It started in 1987 at the Closet of Comics, which was a comic shop in College Park, Maryland. I was going to the University of Maryland at that time. I believe there's still a comic book store there, but they changed their name a few years ago, maybe more than just a few, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. They changed it, I think, to Liberty Comics and Books or something like that. I haven't been over there in quite a while. I still live, it's a 20-minute drive, half-hour drive from where I live. But I haven't been over there in quite some time. I think I went over there once, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, looking for something in particular or just to check it out and see what it was like. Of course, today I can't go over there because it's not open because of the whole situation with the pandemic and non-essential businesses being closed. So over the last month and a half or so, certainly since the lockdown happened, since I've been working at home, I've read the first 4 issues of Xenozoic Tales, all of which are collected in that first kitchen sink collected edition, which was called Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, and I believe that's the first time that they used the name Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. I read the issues in order. If you read the collected edition, they place the stories in the order in which they're supposed to take place, but I'm a big advocate for reading things in the order that they were published and not the order that they're supposed to take place. I enjoyed all these stories. I'm in the process of getting my notes up. I certainly have my notes up for the first 3 of these issues. The 4th one, I think I still have to finish that off. I believe I do. The first issue is all Mark Schultz. I believe the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th issues each have one story drawn by Steve Stiles. Or maybe it's just the 3rd and the 4th issues. There's at least 2 stories drawn by Steve Stiles. And while they're not as pretty as some of the work by Mark Schultz, I think he does an excellent job with the visual storytelling. And once again, these stories were written by Mark Schultz, so it's not like he didn't have any input on them. He just didn't do the visuals, and I don't know if he basically gave the script to Steve Stiles and Steve Stiles then drew it from there, or if he thumbnailed it, or if they talked about how to do it, or how much feedback he gave to Steve Stiles on how to draw it, and that sort of thing. There is a big change. It's interesting because the first couple issues and also the story from Death Rattle number 8 are in one style, and then with the 3rd issue, Mark Schultz's work becomes much more fine-lined. It really changes. It's a big difference. I like his artwork in the first 2 issues in the story in Death Rattle, but there's definitely a big noticeable change in what he does. I think his line work becomes a little more fine-lined. The lines aren't quite as thick. And to my eyes, from my experiences reading comic books, it looks more like Wally Wood in the first 3 issues. In other words, Death Rattle number 8 and 1 and 2 of Xenozoic Tales. And then 3 and 4 and going forward from there, it looks to me more like something that Al Williamson drew. Or in the same style as Al Williamson. But the series is the stories are all interconnected. The main characters are Hannah Dundee and Jack Tenrec, and they kind of represent 2 different opposing views. This takes place like 450 years in the future. The world has kind of been turned upside down. As the title Cadillacs and Dinosaurs implies, there are creatures from a bygone era that have come back to life or have returned. So you have large dinosaurs, you have small dinosaurs, you have flying dinosaurs. Hannah Dundee is an ambassador from a people called the Wassoon, and she has traveled to the City in the Sea, which is where Jack Tenrec is based. And so there aren't that many people. Humanity is kind of rebuilding itself. This all takes place in a rather compact area. It seems to be the eastern coast of the United States, but it's not exactly clear where it is. The stories are each complete stories, so you could pick up a single issue and read it and understand it, but there are also, if you read it from the beginning, you will see that the stories are interrelated. There are things that happen in earlier stories that are mentioned or that are picked up on. There are characters who will show up, recurring characters who show up throughout, but Tenrec and Dundee are the main characters in the strip, and at least one of them shows up in every story. I'm not sure if they both show up in every story, because I can think of at least one story which I don't think Jack shows up in at all. And I think, and that was one of the backup stories, but I think it was one of the earlier ones where Mark Schultz was, probably from the second issue, where Mark Schultz was doing the art. Maybe from the first one. Anyhow, I'm really enjoying that. I want to continue reading this. It's probably been a little over a week since I read the fourth issue, but I do want to get into reading some other things. Like I want to get back to New Teen Titans, the 1980 series, which actually at this point I'm into Tales of the Teen Titans. I'm reading the trade paperback collections, and I have the first 7 or 8 trade paperback collections at this point. I think I have the first 7. I need to buy the 8th one. I think there's at least 10, or maybe it's 11 or 12 so far. So I want to get all of those, and I'm up to the point in that series that basically I was reading it a little bit when I was a kid. When I would have been about 12, I think, or 13 when the stories I'm up to came out. And I was reading some of them, like I read the Judas Contract when it first came out. But I haven't read much beyond there. So it'll be interesting to see, because one of the things that happens at that point is that George Perez basically leaves the book. He continues to do covers, I think, for the book, but there's a very limited amount past the Judas Contract that he draws for New Teen Titans. I think because he goes on to work on Crisis on Infinite Earths, and there may be one or two other things that are, well, Wonder Woman, of course, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, but between, actually, I think it was 1984 when the Judas Contract came out. You know, I've got the book right in front of me, the trade paperback. I should just open it up because it'll say what years the Judas Contract was. Yeah, it was 84. So that wasn't too long before Crisis on Infinite Earths. I think that started in 85. But I think he drew, because of course there was the 1984 series, because right about the time that the Judas Contract, or just before the time that Judas Contract began, they started publishing a new series called the New Teen Titans, the 84 series. And I believe he did just the first story, the first arc, which I think was the first 5 issues. I think that's the Terror of Trigon or something like that. And so that's going to be in these collected editions. But I need to get back to that. I want to read some more of that. And that actually was not on my list of things that I wanted to say here, wanted to talk about, but I'm going to keep going. So I mentioned Xenozoic Tales. So the next thing on my list here, well, there's some cartoons on my list, and I'm not going to say a whole lot about these, hopefully. But I did finally get back to Young Justice. I am into the second half of Season 2 of Young Justice, which I'm really enjoying. I think it's a very good season. We'll see how it all pans out. I was a little surprised. I didn't realize that it was only 20 episodes as opposed to 26 episodes like the first season. First season I really like. I've watched it 3 times. I have notes on it at Small Screen Scrolls, all 26 episodes. And I know I talked about it on some old episodes of the podcast a long time ago. I think when I was watching it for the second time. It's not perfect, but I really like some of the things that the series does. And you should search for Young Justice under either Dave Talks Comics or DaveTalksComics.com or Small Screen Scrolls, which is at smallscreenscrolls.blogspot.com. And you can find all my thoughts on that series there. I've never read the comic book. I've looked at the comic book a few times, and it doesn't, I don't know, there's something about the art that doesn't really appeal to me. I don't know. I'm probably being a little prejudiced. I can't remember who, I'm definitely being prejudiced here. I don't know who I'm judging the art, and I'm not sure I can't remember who wrote and who drew it, but it doesn't appeal to me. And I like the cartoon, the animated series so much that I'm happy enough with it. I don't feel like I need to read the comic book. But I've certainly heard people on shows like Comic Geek Speak who speak very fondly of it, and I think that from what I understand, there are things that are pulled from the comic book into the animated series. So I'm really enjoying this. I don't have season 3. I'm watching this on DVD, and I don't have a subscription yet to the DC, whatever DC's online service is. And I believe it's on there. It used to be on Netflix, but of course they pulled it once they started that online service for DC Comics. So that's no longer an option. One of the other series that I finally got back to, animated series, this is an anime series, Star Blazers 2199. I'm now 4 episodes in to the second half of the season. They call it season 2, but it's really just one big long run. But I purchased it through Amazon Prime, so I'm able to watch it that way. Thinking now I probably should have gotten the DVDs, but I'm not sure what sort of extras they have. But I'm watching it subtitled, of course, because that's the way I prefer to watch anime. And I watched the original Star Blazers or parts of it when I was a kid. I don't own the DVDs of the original Star Blazers. I believe they are available, but it's only dubbed, as it was when I was a kid. I'm not. There are moments in this that I really like. There are things about it that I really like, but on the whole, it feels like they're pushing it a little too fast. I think the original series was longer than this. This is only 26 episodes for the first season, and it does feel sometimes like they're really rushing through things. And that's probably what I don't like about it. There are little things, character things, moments, things that come together, seeing the way the different characters interact that I like. It's interesting to see the dynamics of what's going on the bad guy side as well as on the evil aliens side as well as on the good guy side. So I'm enjoying it. I'm kind of taking a break from it now to watch Young Justice, but another show that I finally picked up again, and I think the reason why I didn't continue with this the first time I picked it up, and I only watched the first episode, and that's Duckman. I bought the complete DVD set of Duckman. I think it's 4 seasons. I wasn't too crazy about the first episode. I really didn't like it. At this point, I've only watched episodes 1 and 2, but the second episode I thought was a huge improvement, much more reminded me of what Duckman was like, what I remember about Duckman from the mid-1990s. It was a series that was voiced by, I don't remember where it ran, if it was on Nickelodeon or MTV or VH1 or some other network that ran it back then. But it was definitely, it's more adult cartoon. I mean, there's no nudity in it. I don't think there's any cursing in it, but I could be wrong about that. But it was just a wacky sense of humor that this, just absurd and sense of humor that you'd see in this cartoon quite often. And the main character, Duckman, is voiced by Jason Alexander, who of course is probably best known for being on Seinfeld and has done plenty of other things. But I never saw all of this, so it's kind of fun. The second episode has Duckman. He's trying to track down a painting that's been stolen from a televangelist, and he somehow gets killed and goes up to heaven, and then he comes back and he's convinced he has to preach to everybody about how they should be living their lives, and of course that eventually goes out the window. But it's just and the humor, there's just these non sequiturs and this, I don't know, I just love it. I just love this episode. This was everything that I remembered about Duckman, even though I don't specifically remember this episode. I don't know if I have any clear recollections of any episodes of Duckman, but maybe at some point I'll come across something that I remember. And I think that's about it for the cartoons that I've been watching. The only other things, let's see, I've got a few more things on my list here that I wanted to mention. I've started to read Ron Goulart's Great History of Comic Books. I think this came out in the 1980s or maybe even early 90s. And on the front it says the Great History of Comic from the 1890s to the 1980s, but the bulk of the book is basically, and I'm 4 chapters in at this point, the bulk of it is about stuff that he remembers growing up. And so it starts with early comic books and comic strips from like the 1920s and the 1930s. And in the 3 chapters, the second, third, and fourth chapters, basically each chapter covers certain comic books and talks about things he remembers from their run. And one of the neat things is that you can go online today, and a lot of these comic books are not things, these are not, at the point I'm at in the book, he has yet to get to Superman. Superman's been mentioned, but he has yet to get to Superman or any of the superheroes. So a lot of these are either humor stories or adventure stories. Some of them are reprints from comic strips, and some of them are original to comic books. But he talks about some of the ongoing stories, because all of these comic books were basically anthologies. There was no one character in a book. And I think even once you get into the superhero era, they still would continue that. You'd have several characters appearing in each comic book. And there might be one character who's the main character, like Superman in Action Comics or Batman in Detective Comics. Although, of course, Batman didn't start in Detective Comics until issue 27. But still, even after that character became the main character, you still would have all these different backup strips. They weren't necessarily backup strips. It was an anthology book, so the one character might be the main character. Anyhow, you can actually go online and find some of these old comic books that he talks about. And these are things which have not been reprinted, I don't think. At the point I'm at in the 1930s, and so he'll talk about a comic book, and he'll talk about so in issue 1 it started with these kinds of stories, and in issue 20 you got a shift to these kinds of stories, and this character started to show up, but he only ran for 9 issues, and so it's that kind of stuff. And some of these books ran for 20, some of them ran for 10 or 20 issues, some of them ran for well over 100 issues. One of the interesting things that I didn't know about that I found out was, I knew that, now I'm blanking on it, the original Famous Funnies? Was that the original comic book? I think it was. The original comic book, what's considered to be the first comic book, which originally was just a collection of comic strips, reprintings of comic strips, but it's, I think, the closest thing to, newsstand comic books that would, eventually become the norm for what would be considered to be a comic book. But there was a number of covers, apparently, that Wally Wood did, Buck Rogers covers. Was it Buck? Yeah, I think it was Buck Rogers. It wasn't Flash Gordon. I believe it was Buck Rogers that he did. And you can find them. I mean, you can the issues themselves will cost you a lot of money. But you can find images of these covers. They're beautiful covers. Some of them are really gorgeous. But I had no idea that Wally Wood had done. And so this was like the late 30s, I think, that he was doing this work. Maybe it was a little later than that. Maybe it was into the 40s. I'm not sure. Anyhow, it's an interesting read. It's not, at this point, covering anything that I've really read. I've only read a limited number of Golden Age comics. Off the top of my head, I know I've read some of The Spirit, which actually was an insert in a comic, in a newspaper insert. It wasn't actually a comic book back then. And I have the first volume of the Plastic Man DC Archive. I've read that. And, I have that collection of Lou Fine comics, which includes like things that he drew, like the Black Condor, and I think the Ray. There's a story that he did for the Ray. And you can find some of those online. You can read them for free online. I think you can even download them if you sign up with this website. If you just like Google Golden Age comics online or something like that, you should be able to find this. But it was neat because this book is kind of old. It has some color pages, but it also has a lot of reprints in black and white. And so I was able to go online and find some of these features because some of them just sounded so crazy. I just was interested to see what they were all about and what they looked like. And it was kind of neat to be able to see what they look like in color. Which kind of brings me to a pet peeve of mine. Excuse me, my voice is going, I guess. And that's reprints that... The reprints that I get in things like, if you buy old comic books online from like, and I say buy them online, I mean buy digital copies from like Comixology, or if you're reading on Marvel, is it Marvel Comics Unlimited or whatever it's called, that service, which I still have a membership to, although I'm definitely not getting my money's worth these days because I'm not reading enough. But some of the old comic strips, the old comic books that they reproduce, they've recolored them, and they just, they look so flat. They don't look as crisp. And I have some of the original comic books, and I can compare them to what I'm seeing on the screen, and it just does not compare. I don't know why they don't just do photographs of these, just scan them. It would look better, even if the comic books have, faults. I think quite often they would look better. Just the recoloring, I don't know why. I mean, they obviously have to pay somebody to recolor them, so why? Anyhow. I don't think I have a whole lot more to say about Ron Goulart's book. I was able to find one of his other books available. His books, he did 2 volumes on comic book artists, and one of them is available online at... the Internet Archive. I think it's archive.org is the website. And I found it there. I downloaded it as a PDF. So I'm going to have to, which I think I had this at one point. It's possible I still have it. It's around my apartment somewhere. It's possible I don't, because I think I got it when I was a kid. I think it was a gift from my parents for Christmas or something like that. But the cover was done by John Byrne. And it shows an artist, I think it's John Byrne, surrounded by drawing at a drawing board, and he's got a bunch of characters looking over his shoulder. And it has like 2 pages each on like a number, like maybe 50 or 100 different artists, something like that. The only other thing that I've been reading that's not really a comic book, but is comic book related, is my youngest brother gave me the 100 Greatest Moments of the Justice League book for my birthday a couple months ago. And so I'm like 70% of the way through it at this point. I'm into the 6th chapter, which is the Enemies chapter. There are definitely some things in here that I've read, but not a lot. I mean, it's probably more than 10% of the moments that I've read so far I have read in the comic books in their entirety. And yeah, probably more than 10%, probably about a dozen of them that I've actually read. There are quite a few Silver Age moments from before I would have read. There's a few of those, well, not the Silver Age, but some of the Bronze Age ones I've read. A few of them, like the first appearance of the Freedom Fighters. I have those issues. I've read that. And there's a few others, like the time that the Justice League and the Justice Society teamed up with the Legion of Superheroes. Yeah, stories like that I've read. And then there was the Joe Kelly run of Justice League, which I've read. And there's a couple of moments that include a couple of moments from those issues that I've read. And that's a series I want to go back and read. And I have all those comics. But so it's a decent read. It's put together by Robert Greenberger. I've seen a number of his presentations at his panels at the Baltimore Comic-Con over the past 10 years. I don't think it's the best book. If you can get it at a discount, a steep discount, I'd say take it, if you like the Justice League. But I'm not crazy about it. It feels like it feels like they picked the number 100 and now they're trying to backfill into that. They're trying to make sure they've got 100 moments. Some of these moments don't feel like they're probably all that memorable. Some of the ones that I haven't read, I don't feel any interest in reading them. There's a few that kind of pique my interest and I want to know a little more about. There's some of them I want to go back and reread at this point. But it's an interesting read. So I'm kind of handling it like I do reading Terry and the Pirates. Instead, as opposed to reading one page a day, I read one moment a day. And I don't read it every single day, but I've probably been reading at least 3 or 4 moments a week, usually. And it's, like I said, it's a decent read. There's some text material in there, which I think was written by Robert Greenberger, but I'm not sure. He may have just edited the whole project. He may have just been in charge of it, and somebody else might have done the text writing. Because there's some of the text writing that, it just sounds like they're describing the stories. And it doesn't feel like, first he describes one story, then he describes another story, then he describes another. These are like the intros to the chapters. And then there'll be like a little bit of text at the bottom of the page, and they'll have a panel, or maybe 2 panels from a story. Not a panel, like a page, or 2 pages, or in some cases more than 2 pages from a story. Or sometimes the moment will be featuring a particular character or a and they'll have one moment from when they were first introduced and another moment from another appearance maybe 20 or 30 years later. So a character who first appeared in the Silver Age and then another appearance from like the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. And then other times they might have 3 or 4 pages just on a single character from a single appearance. So, like I said, some of them I like, some of them I'm kind of about, don't do anything for me. Some of them are interesting for historical reasons, but that's the 100 greatest moments of the Justice League. The only thing I have left on here to talk about that I can think of, and that's I am falling way behind in my podcast listening, specifically in my comic book podcast listening. I'm probably about 5 weeks behind at this point. And I've got to say, there are some things I'm just going to have to stop listening to because I'm just falling further and further behind. Some of these podcasts seem to have picked up the pace in what they are producing, putting out there, unlike my podcast, ha ha ha. And it's just way too much for me. It's just way too much. 4 or 5 hours a week is too much. It's just, and I'm thinking of shows like Word Balloon and the Oh Yeah podcast, which I really do enjoy the show or those shows, but there's just so much material these days. I can't keep up with it. I cannot keep up with it. I prefer a show that produces, puts out an hour, maybe 2 hours a week, once a week, or less, maybe once a month or twice a month, something like that. I can live with that. So I think I'm going to have to put that to the side. I unfortunately think I'm probably going to stop listening to most of Geek Brunch. I'll probably listen to Mike M's weekly reads, since that's usually shorter and not as frequent. Or maybe I'll listen to some of Mike's other podcasts, like his Collector's Corner. I'll listen to that. And I'll listen to his programs on, maybe I'll start listening to his DC Comics programs, which I don't think come out quite as frequently. So I think that's about it. I've been talking for a little while now. I think it's time I think I've gotten this out of my system. I woke up this morning and I wanted to record something. First I was just going to write something on my Facebook page about Dave Talks Comics and my reading and how I haven't been reading that much, but I really got the urge to record something. So hopefully I'll get this out maybe this weekend or maybe next weekend I'll get it out. And maybe I can do this at least once a month, something like that, especially considering the pace at which I'm reading. And it just doesn't seem like there's enough material here for me to record every week. And honestly, in a way, I prefer to write about these things. And so if you're interested in reading about what I've been reading, you can go to davetalkscomics.net, which is where my notes are. Although sometimes they are much more summary than they are commentary. And that's just the way it is, I guess. So hopefully I'll get back into Teen Titans. I want to get back into Ikigami. I read the first 4 volumes of that. I would like to get back into that and read. There's 10 altogether, and I have the first 8. And I've read the first 8 before. But I want to get back, start up with a volume 5 maybe. So maybe I can flip-flop between that and Teen Titans over the next week or so. And maybe I can read volume 5 and finish off volume 7 of the new Teen Titans collections. So, and as well as continue with the Ron Goulart book, continue with the 100 Greatest Moments of the Justice League, continue with Terry and the Pirates, and of course continue with the cartoons that I mentioned before. That's it for episode 172 of Dave Talks Comics. This podcast can be found at davetalkscomics.com as well as wherever podcasts are usually found, like iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. You can keep up with what I have currently been reading at davetalkscomics.com and what I have been watching at smallscreenscrawls.blogspot.com. I usually update these blogs on a daily or weekly basis. Links to Small Screen Scrawls can be found at davetalkscomics.com or davetalkscomics.net under the Other Blogs header on the right-hand side of the page. .com for the cast, .net for the notes. If you have comments or questions, I can be reached at davetalkscomics@gmail.com, on Twitter @DaveTalksComics, or leave a comment on my website. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening. 3, 2, oh shit, what's the episode number for this? Just realized I don't know what episode this is. $171, $172. Looks like it's 172. Okay.